In this session, we are going to talk about ideas from legends, folklores, and fables. What is folk and how do we look at folk and what is our understanding of folk? Folk is primarily a form of literature in which language, arts, and culture intersect. So, three things to pay attention to whenever we look at folk at the first place is the language, the art of that particular time and space, and the culture that people are associated with. The combination of these three would give you an idea or understanding about what particular kind of a folk form is this. And this is primarily from a literary point of view or from a literature point of view. So what it does, it fosters our understanding and acceptance of the foreign language and culture. So we tend to look at folk mostly from a point of view of withdrawal, that we tend to step aside and see folk or any kind of a folk-based material as something that is alienated, as something that is um, not a part of your culture, native culture, so to say. I mean, this is something that can be counter questioned that I can have folk from my place or my culture that's there. But what it does is the moment you say folk, even within your culture, when you say folk, you tend to separate yourself from that story and observe that story in its most natural form. That's why that is the reason why I've used the term foreign language and culture. So the moment you step out of that, irrespective of whether you belong to that place or you speak that same language or it's a part of your culture, you tend to kind of step aside and look at it as a new material. What it does is folk also integrates cognitive tasks, language skills, and learning strategies. Okay, so folk is used extensively across the world to integrate what we understand as cognitive tasks, the things that our mind can do, then helps us develop language skills, okay, pick up languages from different places, and learning strategies. Okay, most of the times what happens is folk stories, especially, they work as great learning strategies, great storytelling strategies, because there is always a moral that is associated, or at least the observation has been so far in that sense that there is some sort of a moral grounding or a moral landing to those sort of narratives. So folk tales are primarily oral literature, oral being the oldest form of literature. It is also a primary source of language. So whenever you look at the development of a language, you try to look for the source of its origin, and you would find epics, poetries, hero sagas, myths, legends, fairy tales, fables, ghost stories, um, all these kind of genres or subgenres of folk tales to be contributing somewhere to the development of a language. It could be four-line poetry that can give you understanding or a meaning to a certain text or a certain language, or it could be the story of a mythological hero or his journey or her journey from one particular period to another. All those things kind of gives you a fine, interesting perspective about what folktales are or what folktales rather do or can do possibly for humankind. These stories blend reality and fantasy through the repetition of simple language and story patterns. Okay, the combination of reality and fantasy. So there are those characters who appear to be extremely real. They appear to be um, people belonging to our universe, regular, and then there will be these fantastical moments where they can convert themselves into superheroes or you know, legendary people or people from the fantasy. So it's the combination of these two, and which comes in the most simplistic sort of a language or story pattern that makes those stories interesting or believable and offers us the kind of content that from generations we have been consuming. In traditional tales, the common people express their values, fears, and dreams over generations. Okay, so it is in the commonality of their existence that these heroes come closer to us, that they have fears, they have insecurities, they have a certain value system, they have anxieties, and then they overcome that. So it's basically the overcoming part of um, the human side that makes them, dreamlike characters, that creates legends around them, or that creates folks around them. A folk tale exists to be told in the traditional oral style. So whenever you visit villages or semi-urban places where there has been a long tradition of storytelling, you would come across oral storytellers engaging and offering you narratives which are drawn from folk, from urban, from fables, from stories that blend in this concept of fantasy and reality. And also understand that each storyteller tells stories differently, and a story is different every time it's told. So that's also one of the reasons why um, there are several versions to different kind of myths and legends. There are different point of view, there are different perspectives, because every time a storyteller is trying to tell a story, he or she is going to offer the kind of content from their own understanding, their own perspective, their own point of view. So stories would vary. The tailor's building materials are words, sounds, language patterns, um, the way they are going to speak, the kind of sounds they use in order to make the story or the narrative a little more authentic. The tools are the voices, the face, the hands, the storytelling craft. They are primarily the product of mutual creation of a special human experience, of a world based on words and imagination. So right now, if you are listening to any kind of story, not viewing it, listening to any kind of story, let's say from your grandparents or your parents, or incident that has happened with them, or their grandparents and parents telling them the stories. That's how the storytelling tradition has been passed on over a period of time from that state wherever it was to the current situation where we are in right now. Remember that this is a combination of words and imagination. Whatever your parents or grandparents or your friends or their parents or every person who is a storyteller you come across, they are blending in these two things. They are bringing in their imagination um, into the narrative and trying to retell a story in terms of words, with words. And in doing so, they're offering you a certain kind of human experience that is magical in nature, something that you tend to believe in. That's why when we are growing, when in our growing up years, we would believe in those kind of stories very strongly. And one example that comes to your mind at this point in time is the primary reason behind the success of the Harry Potter series, whether it is the film or the book, is this, that there is a sense of belief. Even in the millennial kids who are so increasingly um, associated with gadgets and hyper reality and so on, they tend to have accepted the universe of Harry Potter that was created. So that brings in, kind of reiterates or reassures or reaffirms um, the stronger belief in magic, the stronger belief that using human experiences, using the regulations of human existence, there can be materials that could be written or presented or filmed and screened, which pronounces this sort of a combination of fantasy and reality. Because many times we tend to accept that as our own reality. We used to live in the world of fantasy. Okay. Most of us tend to do that. We like to do that. Okay. Whether we might agree with the world of fantasy or we disagree, but we tend to like the world of fantasy, and we most of the times wish to live in that world of fantasy. That has kind of shifted this narrative from literature to painting to photography to cinema to now you have virtual reality, augmented reality, all these kind of things. So when narrative storytelling would have emerged back in the day. It would have emerged from the story of a thing that did not exist, and it can only be told in the past. So the movement from there is possible or is brought in because there is some sort of stories people told. Understand this: every legend, every folklore, every story that you listen to has got a very strong rural, native oral hold and side to it, and what you experience at this point in time in terms of literature or in terms of painting are basically a reinterpretation of that extended universe. So every time there is a storyteller who is trying to tell a story from the legend, from the myth, or using that as a source material, they are kind of expanding that universe based on that extensive world. So moments from the legends, folklores, and fables allow human beings to slip into the fantastical. So the moment they see that, they tend to enter into a world which is far removed from their reality. They want to experience and enjoy during that moment. We call these stories as meta narratives because there is grandeur associated with them. Okay, what are meta narratives? When any story, what we understand as a narrative, where there is a narration, is expanded, it's huge, and the universe is large. We call meta is a synonym for large. So when we talk about meta narratives, we tend to um, have several layers to the stories. Stories told from different point of view, different perspective, in different eras, different times, told from different characters' point of view, and all of them have a larger than life image or larger than life experience associated with them. That's why we say that these are meta narratives because there is a certain amount of grandeur associated with them, grandeur that ordinary people cannot fathom, a grandeur that ordinary people only wish or dream about. So that's what it is. It's dreamlike. The dynamism of these stories, the dynamism these stories bring with them, direct us to the world of make believe. Okay, it's this fantastical nature of those stories that kind of directs us to a world of make believe that we tend to like. That okay, this is true. This is the reality of that existence. What you derive out of it is pleasure, joy, happiness, magic, and that gives you some sort of a comprehensive understanding into that world that exists. Most of the times, the story would begin with once upon a time, XYG things happened. There was a king, there was a queen, and things happened, and the king died, and rest the prince, and the prince would go on to marry another queen, princess, and that princess was a witch. Okay, let's say, for example, this is that is there, or a witch who had a secret society, who was a part of secret society, who want to resurrect the society and whatever. So you can begin any story with once upon a time. You can begin any story with once upon a time and try to go back. So the moment you say once upon a time, it is referential to the past. It constantly teleports the audience, the listeners, the viewers to divert their attention from their existence, uh, current reality or their primary existence, and teleports them world of hyperbolicism. Okay, so what follows is not merely an interpretation of a tale, but a recreation of an entire universe. So the moment your grandparents switch from their afternoon nap to tell you a story because you're troubling them, or that you want to hear the story of, that flying horse or that mermaid, whatever you would have grown up listening to, they are not just trying to tell a story. They are recreating an entire universe for you. And I haven't chosen, consciously, I haven't chosen too many of Indian examples from Hollywood, though you'll find numerous examples of cinema drawn from, or cinematic ideas drawn from folks' fables. I have given you some sort of kind of a detour from the regular routine ones. but yeah, it's also important to acknowledge the fact that is the Ramayanas and the Mahabharats and the Hindu mythologies and the Greek mythologies and religious mythological narratives or folk tales that has lent us so many stories around to create, recreate, to retell. So when you look at it from the point of view of Ramayana and Mahabharata, we tend to associate our cultural, traditional narrative storytelling with it. And from there, when you move to a DC or a Marvel Cinematic Universe, you know that, okay, these are the characters which are fantastical in nature and they can do ordinary things like you and me. And this is where reality comes in. And they can also um, move in to do things which are magical in nature, which is where the fantasy and mythification of narratives encapsulate the viewer's minds. Okay, we get thrilled by watching a DC film or um, a MCU film because they are based on the stories that we have grown up listening to. So in this way or that way, we tend to connect, and because we connect, these narratives carry potential to leave us with several moments of magic, and it's that magic that kind of allows us um, to spend quite some amount of time understanding or listening to kind of stories that are offered to us from these franchises or the meta narratives like Ramayanas and Mahabharats. Okay, the three films that I wanted to talk about before I break into the Q&A and actually talk a bit about the writing aspect of how this is done is a 1964 film called Kwaidan, whose trailer we just saw. It's a film by Masaki Kobayashi. It's a Japanese film, and it's one of the horror subgenre film that was popularized in the 1960s and 70s. And there are 4 chapters, as you would have seen in intertitles. Um, and these stories are based on Han's collection of Japanese folktales, which is drawn from Japanese folktales, primarily Kwaidan, stories of studies and strange things that we tend to uh, ignore most of the times unless it comes on to us. Okay, we would pass it pass them as stories which are, oh, this happens in some other world. Okay, so it's that some other world sometimes which can create the believable narratives. That's where folk comes into picture. So how do you understand and interpret stories? So there is a literary material which is there, and you are trying to revisit that literary material and translate it onto the screen. So drawing from primarily from the studies of Stranger Things by Kwaidan was created. All the 4 sections are excellent, but the best is undoubtedly Oichi the Earless, the tale of the blind musician of unsurpassed skill, commanded by a ghostly imperial court to perform the epic ballad of their deathbed. Drawing on the aspects of kabuki and bunraku puppet theatre, Kobayashi makes few concessions to realism, instead drawing out from the very theatricality of his source material to create one of the finest depictions of the supernatural to ever appear on screen. And you would come across, if you read Japanese folk tales, especially the ones that were produced in the 1940s and 50s, you see that they blend in magic realism so much and offer you the kind of content and context which is extremely political in nature, but at the same time gives you a visual depiction of moments, of time period, of costumes, of people, of characters, which kind of unfold the magic in front of you. So drawing from very elementary folktale materials, whether it is puppet theatre or the kind of music that you would hear throughout, it's very haunting. You know? So somewhere what would happen is it would allow you to enter right into the character's universe and stay there for quite some time. I have screened Kwaidan a couple of times, earlier, and the response has been overwhelming in that sense. A lot of people who tend to um, who are genre gratifiers, like I call them genre gratifiers. They try to gratify themselves by watching genre films. They would love it, and if you would get a chance to watch the film, I would really suggest that you watch, and then you would have an idea why this kind of writing is so essential. As long as there is a source material, there cannot be a reproduced material in terms of the screenplay. Unless there is a screenplay, there cannot be a film. So how do you kind of do this transition or the journey from start to finish and carry a conversation forward around this mysticism that gets associated with the visual depiction that you see in the narrative? Next one is called Funeral Parade of Roses. It's a 1968 film by Toshio Matsumoto, which is again a Japanese film. Um, the reason why I chose this film, as an example, is also because our understanding of folk and um, fables are limited to mythological narratives that has been told over a period of time. Okay, um, how do you subvert a mythological narrative and create something which is extremely fascinating in nature? So, Funeral Parade of Roses does that. It kind of subverts the Oedipus narrative, Oedipus myth that is there, part of the Greek mythology, the story of Oedipus Rex, um, and kind of reinterprets it, subverts it by placing characters in a very documentary kind of style in the 1960s and converting, subverting um, the gender dynamic that exists between in a regular narrative. So what happens here is you are trying to propose something extremely new. It's experimental in nature, as you've seen the images. Um, there is some sort of a self-referentiality when you talk about it. When you are posing as a character, which you may or may not be, um, in an interview, for example, how much of artist you are bringing in, how much of performance you are bringing in, and how much of your own self you are bringing in. So, is there a superfluous blend or kind of a fluidity between who you are as a person and what kind of things you're offering as a character? So, when the character that you're playing or enacting kind of drops its guard down and your realism takes over, you tend to create something which is magical in nature. So, in such sort of a situation, when you are subverting a narrative, you are reflecting upon the counterculture period of the 1960s in Tokyo, um, about a gay subculture movement. You are trying to empower a large group of, um, you know, potential communities by telling their stories, which would otherwise go unnoticed. So you are taking an already controversial existing you know um, subculture genre and trying to collide it with a mythical narrative, drawing from the mythical narrative, reinterpreting them. So moving from the sensual love scenes to exploitative outbursts of violence, the low comedy to high tragedy, while incorporating documentary style realism with wild, highly stylized fantastical sequences. Funeral Parade makes an essential cult cinema viewing. It's something that again, you have to watch the film to understand what I'm trying to say. And in terms of writing, how far you can, as a student writer, how far you can push yourself by, in terms of reinterpretation of a mythical narrative or a folk-based narrative, and how a small, idea drawn from the complex story of Oedipus Rex um, can lead to a full-fledged feature film. So this is something that you will come across when you would see or read those kind of cinema. And the last one is a film called Nosferatu. It's a silent film made in 1922 by Murnau. It's a German expressionistic film, and German expressionism is a film movement that was started in 1926. That sort of a period. Primarily 1920s was when dominated, um, drawn essentially from the expressionistic paintings that were produced. This film was one of the earliest silent horror films, and it was an adaptation again of Stoker's Dracula. Um, what happens here is he could not get rights. Brunau could not get rights to the novel, so he simply changed the names, and so the Dracula that you hear or read about or watch later on, Bram Stoker's Dracula, that will be made is basically an interpretation of Murnau's Nosferatu. So he would change the character from Count Dracula to Count Orlok. So Orlok is the ghostly figure that you would see with long nails and this animal kind of a face which is there. So of the changes made from the source novel, by far the most significant was the depiction of the vampire itself. So whether it is an urban myth or story from the legend, vampires do exist, and then um, it's how do you what is your interpretation of the vampire? The other day when I screened you, sorry, I showed you a trailer, small trailer of in which briefly you see a girl enacting the character of a vampire. So is your vampire from the 1920s? In an era where black and white movies existed, where there were no dialogues, where there were only intertitles. So how do you kind of imagine a character like that and take that character, which was played by Max Streck, German artist, a character whose appearance and behavior is close or very close to a Strigoi. Strigoi is basically a troubled spirit that is said to have been out of grave. If you Google the word and go to images, you would see several images. This largely from the Roman mythology, and you take that character and kind of create a subhuman character out of it, and then place it in a relatively urban setting, or urban setting in a sense, a gradually changing society, which would move from you know um, the rural atmospherics to slightly accepting urban atmospherics. What sort of a character you would write, or what sort of a character impression you would like to create around people who would believe that, okay, this sort of a vampire does exist. So one of the finest films that were now produced back in the day in 1922. Yeah, so this is more or less about an introduction to the kind of ideas that were drawn historically around folk or myth or legends, or those kind of stories, and how do you take them forward in terms of the writing, and why it is essential that we believe that these kind of stories can work. So I'll stop here, and then we can take the questions.